So thank you for joining us. My first question is, what's the biggest challenge facing the transatlantic relationship between the U.S. and Europe today?
Well, I think it's finding a common mission between the two. Right now, Europe and most European policymakers believe that they face multiple challenges. Russia on the east, chaotic Mediterranean, refugees, terrorism, where in the United States there is maybe a sense of calm for the first time in a long time. President Obama has really stressed that we don't face any real imminent threats. So it's created sort of an asymmetrical relationship between the United States and Europe, where Europeans want a lot of help, a lot of reassurance, and the United States really doesn't have any kind of compelling mission or reason to provide it. So to me, it's a relationship that has started to, well, in a way, wither and become much less vibrant than it was, say, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago.
And to what extent do you think the Oval Office is directly responsible for that? Obama, I think, started his presidency with this much vaunted pivot to Asia. To what extent did that also constitute a real conscious turn away from Europe?
I think it was less a turn away from Europe and more a message to Europe that we expect you to do more to take care of yourselves. The real drama of the last 5 years has been the return of history to Europe. Europeans who 10 years ago would lecture Americans on our kind of heightened sense of threat and almost accuse us of being paranoid about the world, suddenly are facing many more real imminent threats than most Americans are. So I think the pivot was really a signal, you've got to take care of yourselves. Unfortunately, they didn't really hear that. It was only in 2014, with the events in Ukraine and Crimea, that Europeans woke up and decided that they had to start building up their defenses again, but also creating kind of a strategic culture in Europe which had been allowed to fade away. So yes, does it start at the White House? Yes, of course. The real secret in transatlantic relations is it's not all of the meetings like this or the ones that the State Department and foreign ministries do. It's really the tone set by the highest leaders. And Barack Obama's been pretty clear that he doesn't view Ukraine as a strategic priority for the United States. And frankly, I think he's quite willing to let Europeans take care of themselves.
This Europe taking care of themselves, that's interesting because that's also come up in the presidential campaign, with Trump saying that some of our allies should have to pay their part in order to really receive treaty obligations, or at least that's the implication. So to what extent do you think that has a real constituency in the United States? And do you see that presenting a threat to the unity of NATO?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is, even though they have very different ways of phrasing it, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, and to some extent Bernie Sanders were all saying the same thing. Why should we be providing defense and security services to a continent that is so wealthy and so capable of doing it on their own? Now, I don't agree with that assessment, but I think that all three of them touched on something that resonates with a good many of Americans. The United States and I think the American public really lost their confidence in 2008 with the financial crisis. The combination of two unsuccessful wars and then a kind of an almost frightening economic decline haven't made them feel very good about being assertive in the world. Americans get engaged in the world when either they feel a very, very real imminent threat, like in 9/11, or when they're feeling very, very confident and wealthy, like they were in the late 90s, when the United States did so much to help European integration.
And do you see support for Ukraine as falling within the U.S.'s core strategic interests?
I think making sure that the boundaries of Europe are secure and that no country, whether it's Russia or any other, feels like they can intervene in the sovereignty of others, is in the interest of the United States. Is it a high strategic priority? Yeah, I think it is, but that wouldn't be the opinion of many Americans.
And in terms of, from the perspective of the U.S. government's support for Ukraine, I mean, to what extent does Ukraine's success in reforming itself influence that?
Well, I think one of the things that has happened in the United States over the last 20 years is a good deal of cynicism about reform in Ukraine. Matter of fact, some people would say that's an oxymoron. So I think even though there has been concrete reform in Ukraine, many people in Washington and elsewhere are skeptical that it will persist or that it's real. So I think it's going to take much more on the part of Ukraine before the United States is really willing to wholeheartedly support kind of the next phase.
And with this newly assertive Russia, we've seen a lot of cases in which their jets are buzzing U.S. Ships in the Black Sea, near misses with flights over the Baltics. To what extent is there a risk of an accidental confrontation turning into something larger?
I think that there is some risk, but I wouldn't want to overstate it. One of the things that I think both the Russians and the Americans are pretty good at is containing those kinds of emergency situations so they don't get out of control. I think what would be a much more interesting question in some ways is the fact that over the last 8 years, the United States has never done anything that would keep Russia off balance. So there are the flyovers, there's the near misses, the sort of threatening actions. I think at a previous time, an American president would have come back with a very sharp and loud response that would have made the Russians pause for a second. We haven't been doing that, and I think that Russia, in some ways, all of the situations you cited, are almost kind of endless testing to see when they get to that point where the United States and its allies will finally really react in a very concerted and strong way.
It also seems that from the Kremlin, part of this is motivated by a certain paranoia in the Kremlin about Western intentions. So to what extent does the West have, I mean, do you think that that's a valid analysis of how they think? And second, if so, to what extent does the West have to balance between that sense of paranoia and, pushing back?
I think that there's two factors that operate in the Kremlin. One is a legitimate paranoia that they feel that their interests are threatened on their borders, but the other is the way that they use paranoia among the Russian public to mask over economic problems and other difficulties. There is certainly they are convinced that the United States and Europe to some extent are being aggressive. I don't believe that, but there are people in Russia that believe that. But they also use that sensibility to fire up a certain nationalist fervor in Russia that works very well for Putin's politics.
And do you yourself think that NATO expansion, including the Baltics, was a good idea?
Absolutely.
And now you would make the same decision?
Excuse me?
And now you'd advocate for the same decision?
Yes. Yeah. Listen, these three countries of the Baltics, after what they went through, needed the reassurance that there was actually going to be a powerful response if Russia ever tried to return in force here. I think that it was eminently correct when it was done, and I would still support it absolutely now.
Thank you for taking the time, Craig.
Thank you.